for joining us. Today I have none other than Kate Rivett-Carnac, who is a tourism and green economy researcher and strategist with a master's degree in sustainable development planning and management. I've known Kate for many, many years, and she's an absolute data whiz. So pleased to have her on with us today. She is able to look at the data, to look at things at a macro level, and to really give us some good advice. And today we're going to be talking all things domestic tourism. Kate, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate your time.
It's a great pleasure, Natalia. Nice to be part of the conversation.
Great, thank you so much. Right, so we're talking domestic tourism, and obviously that's been something that we've had to rely on as an industry in the last year, and for the foreseeable future will be something we need to rely on. Tell me a little bit about where you see domestic tourism at the moment in the South Africa space, how it's grown and where it's going.
So I'll just chat through some of the stats. A lot of them are from sort of 2018, 2019, because apart from anything else, the ability to collect data through surveys was somewhat restricted last year. But if we talk about general trends and expenditure and categories, I think largely true, although of course we're seeing some shifts. This is from the Tourism Satellite Account, which is the way we measure tourism's economic contribution to the country. It's a global methodology. And this is sort of the highlights page. And I just thought it'd be useful to start off by saying 120 billion of the value that tourism brought to our economy in 2018 was inbound, whereas 153 was domestic tourism expenditure. So that's quite useful to note already that domestic tourism expenditure was a greater share of overall. And there's also another figure there, which is the middle yellow circle, which was outbound tourism expenditure. And I want to talk about that a little bit as well, Natalia, if we have the opportunity, because that's an opportunity, I think, for the domestic market now.
That would be great.
This is just broken down overall. So that total figure of 153 is the left bar, and it shows you the main categories overall of domestic tourism expenditure. And you can see how important road transport is. And most domestic tourism is VFR. So that would be why the road transport is so important. This one, I think, is an interesting one for the sector to think about. So here I looked at the different tourism, what we call tourism characteristic industries. And I looked at what share of the expenditure in those industries was international or inbound, then domestic, and then local. So local being residents. And this is kind of part of the mindset perhaps we're going to have to get our heads around going forward, as we're not just talking about tourists, we're talking about visitors. And but you can see, and the international is the blue, or the inbound is the blue bits. The domestic is the orange, and the local or residents is the red. So you can see for accommodation, air transport, and travel agencies that domestic's very important and internationals are very important, and locals less. And that makes sense, right? Because locals aren't going to pay for accommodation in the town they live in. But interestingly, for sports and recreation, restaurants, and road transport, your local is the biggest share. And then with differing importance for domestic and international. So that's really, really critical as we think about the markets we have currently under COVID. So not just domestic tourists, but also locals. I thought that was an interesting way of cutting it up. And then I've got a few slides on the importance of domestic tourism to small towns. I think that's something we don't talk about a lot. Chris Rogerson, who's at UJ, has done quite a lot of work in this area. The data is a little bit dated, as you can see, but the trend's important. And you can see in the bottom left-hand corner with the pie charts that domestic tourism really is still the lifeblood of small towns. So there I'm looking at 2001 and 2012 and the share of domestic and international of trips. So international tourists or inbound tourists had increased in numbers for small towns, but domestic tourists we're still 75% of all tourists. So when we think about small towns and small town regions and economies, domestic tourism really was the lifeblood and still should be and could be. And of course, there are things that, there have been income impacts on domestic tourists and the like, which challenge the ability of South Africans to travel. But nonetheless, small towns should have an opportunity to leverage domestic tourism. This was an interesting slide for me on which small towns are the most reliant on tourism from a GDP perspective. So this is not the same as which small towns get the most tourists. This is those that are most reliant on tourism. So where their economies are fairly, maybe less diversified. And you can see it's really quite interesting. In the Western Cape, and Limpopo, it's Bitu, Knysna, and Bela Bela, where over 40% of the local GDP is tourism. And so these are the areas which would have been really, really, really hard hit by the decline in inbound, but also, of course, domestic tourism and the regulations last year, which constrained travel.
That's a really interesting slide.
Yeah, and that's Chris Rogerson's work as well. And, you know, he's an academic who does excellent work. And because it's often published in fairly long journal articles, the insights aren't extracted. But I do think it's something as a tourism researcher and policymakers, we need to figure out where we can really kind of derive these insights and share them more for planners and for sort of industry associations in the area. And then I just thought we'd look at the latest we have, which is only up to the end of January. So this is Statistics South Africa. They do 2 monthly surveys, which are particularly relevant for tourism. One is accommodation income, and the other is food and beverage serving industry income. So this is the accommodation, and there are 4 categories. And I must just say, this is statistically significant. So while it might not always resonate with an individual firm, overall, it's statistically significant and relevant. So it's for all tourism firms that are registered with SARS. That's the total amount. And then they've taken a sample that represents the different categories. And you can see that they've got 4 categories of accommodation enterprises. Hotels is yellow, guest houses and guest farms are together and then red, caravan parks and camping sites in blue. And then other accommodation is a bit of a clunky category. It includes lodges and things like B&B. So it's a bit harder to understand what's going on in there. But, you know, the hotels have continued to really suffer, and with a little bit of a uptick in December. But of course, then with the regulations and from what was it, the 27th of December?
Yeah.
So particularly the 15th of Jan coinciding with high season and the like, you see the income. So the total income for all hotels in January 2021 was 77% down on January 2020, which was of course still pre-COVID, January 2020. And I guess hotels are hardest hit because they rely on inbound and they rely on business quite often, whereas a campsite, which is the most resilient category, it's typically domestic leisure and probably less inbound, although Sandparks accommodation is included in the sample. And the Stats SA explained to me they've broken it up across categories. So you will have some of Sandparks and provincial parks campsites included in that blue line. And there you would expect more foreign tourists overall, I would imagine, than a privately owned or municipal campsite. But yeah, I mean, campsites were still 40% down in January, having done much better in October at 30% down. Yeah, it's the least hard hit.
Yeah, and as you say, the hotels at 77% because of so much of the outbound business, or the South African business being corporate based instead of leisure based.
Yeah. So it's very, very tough. Yeah, and I guess also people, you know, so if it's leisure and you're going away, you want to get into nature, you can travel with a small group and it's affordable to go to a campsite or take your, you know, take your caravan. And certainly just amongst my peer group, and we live in Cape Town, so there are lots of really nice campsites, but loads of people I know are doing that over the weekends. F&B, so again, we're looking at the by category total income change year on year, the same month as the previous year. And this is up to the end of January as well. So takeaway and fast food recovered really fast. You can see that, and it's sitting, sorry, you can't see because of our faces, but it's sitting at sort of, I think it's about -8% in January 2021 compared to January 2020. Whereas catering recovered faster after April, after our first lockdown, full lockdown, because I guess caterers were then looking at selling direct to households, but it hasn't managed to maybe make that many gains beyond that, because I guess there's a fair amount of the business that relies on events for caterers. And then restaurants and coffee shops looking a bit better in November last year when they were -27%. So they were down 27% on November 2019, it would have been. But then also the effects of renewed restrictions on alcohol, etc., curfews. Yeah, so tough times, but it is interesting to see the variation in categories and what that, I mean, I suppose what that means for different firms and then for opportunities. I'm just going to, and these are statistics that are probably familiar to a lot of people. And as I said, unfortunately, 2019 is where we're at, but it gives us a sense of where the trends were. So if we look at domestic travel in South Africa, this is data from SA Tourism's research. VFR is the main purpose of travel, at about 15 million VFR trips in 2019, and then holiday is much smaller share, but holiday in fact has been growing quite nicely. And I thought this was really important. So why are people not traveling? Or why weren't people traveling in 2019? And hopefully this has changed a bit. So finance and monetary means, of course, is critical. And that's the yellow, sort of yellowy orange chunk. But look how big that blue section of the pie is. And that's where people are saying we have no reason to travel. And
Wow.
That's really interesting.
That's
And mad, hey? So it's sort of 28%, 30%. So at the top is overnight and underneath it's day trips. But it's very similar picture for the two different length of travel. Yeah, so that's an opportunity, I reckon. A big opportunity.
Is that just the lack of culture of travel, having grown up not ever traveling or not understanding what travel brings you? How do we, the question is, how do we as a tourism industry ignite that?
Yes, it is. And that's a critical question. And then I've taken on, you can see there's another little square here. And I must just say it is not statistically representative, but it's still interesting. This was work that was done about 2 years ago by the province, by their consultants in the Western Cape, when they were trying to look at a new museum. And they did personal interviews in various places, including taxi ranks and the like, in and around Cape Town, and looked at why people weren't visiting museums. And you can see there, I don't have percentages, but you can see that uninterested, not accessible, content is uninteresting, lack of awareness, no opportunity, poor comms are all in the top 10 reasons. So those
around communications and marketing.
And maybe relevance and welcoming, so the culture, and then there's also like how actively are you talking to different market segments? What is your messaging? And so I do think that is an opportunity. And certainly we need more research in this area. And this is the source and destination of domestic travel. This is 2019 again, but you can see Gauteng, of course, many trips are generated by Gautengers. And then the Western Cape would be the second most number of trips. And if I remember correctly, in fact, most of the trips from residents of the Western Cape are in the Western Cape. So this isn't necessarily cross-border, across a provincial border domestic travel. And then Limpopo, of course, get a big share of domestic trips as well. And I guess that's Maria. I mean, it won't be just Maria, but Maria is a big chunk. And if you look at purpose of travel, you see religious travel in Limpopo. What do South Africans like doing? Well, social, shopping, attractions, beach, heritage. It'd be interesting to see how this has changed now. Of course, there's been socials a big challenge. And even, I suppose, shopping, indoor shopping venues, and with markets not operating. Beach has been constrained by regulations. But yeah, this might have all had a big shakeup. We'll have to watch out for the data as it comes out on that. I took this out deliberately this is from a Stats SA 2019 domestic travel survey, and I thought it was important to talk about race, because I think if we don't talk about race, we're hiding away from something in tourism in South Africa. And it was really interesting, if somewhat shocking, to see, if you look at the main purpose of the most recent overnight trip in 2019 for leisure, you still have more white South Africans traveling for leisure than black South Africans. And that's possibly because income inequality is still highly racialized in South Africa, but it might also talk to this thing of I'm not being communicated with effectively, or I don't feel welcomed. And I don't know. I mean, others might be in a better position to interpret that than me, but you can see that Black Africans, South Africans overnight trip for VFR, you're doing 26 million VFR trips in 2019. And then the table below that is the day trips. And there you can see that Black African day trips for leisure are more than white South African day trips for leisure. So that they're sort of starting to change, to shift there. So why do we want to look at South African outbound travel? Well, because South Africans can't travel outside of South Africa at the moment. And so a share of the outbound travel is leisure. And what can we do? And what is being done, perhaps, to capture that locally, right? So there were 6 million outbound departures in 2019, and there were in 2018 as well. December typically is the busiest month. So I guess that's VFR and holiday. Air transport's used for about 40% of the trips. Of those 6 million, 3/4 are to the region, not to the region, to neighboring countries. And you can see in the pie chart there, Mozambique gets a big share. Lesotho gets the highest share. And we don't know, and it's hard to, within this data, get a sense of how much of this would have been, if you like, self-drive safari or to the beach in Mozambique, but it's certainly significant volumes of people. If we talk about outside immediate neighboring destinations, we've still actually got Tanzania right at the end of that graph on the right, so that it is still a region. So my title's not 100% correct, but most of this would have been air by air. And there are 11 countries where there were more than 50,000 South African inbound arrivals to those countries in 2018. I just want to say that this is UNWTO data, and they use different data sets. So I think we must take it more as a sort of a trend analysis than worry too much about the numbers. And also, for some reason, France and Ireland weren't included in the data or didn't pick up one of the data sets. But I mean, it makes sense from what we know. So the UK, despite, and this would be people traveling on South African passports. So despite the tough regulations around visas and the cost of visas, the UK and the US still get a lot of South Africans, and a lot of that, I guess, would be business too. Probably some VFR and some leisure. And then Mauritius, I would have thought Mauritius, Thailand, certainly perhaps Turkey and Tanzania would be more leisure than business. And I'm just saying that because it occurs to me, but not because I've been there. But yeah,
it does make sense. And then of course Australia being VFR probably.
VFR probably Australia. And then you'll have business in all of those contexts as well, but it may be less than leisure and VFR. So, I mean, again, the question is, clearly there's a South African market that's taking beach packages to Mauritius. We know that, and Thailand. It's affordable, no visas, family packages. Even with the airfare, I think sometimes seen in certainly social media, you've seen people say, "Oh, it's cheaper for me to go to Thailand than to some places in South Africa." But there's an opportunity here.
There's definitely an opportunity.
Yes. Yeah. And then I thought this is really, like, I wanted to give you a sense of some data that's really current. It doesn't tell us much that we don't know, but it's still nice to see the stats. So I like seeing the stats because I like numbers. But this is the Google Mobility Report for the 21st of March. And they look at so that was a Sunday, and they look at how that corresponds to the same day of the week in relation to the median between the 3rd of Jan and the 6th of February 2020, which would have been our high season, right? Just before COVID. And so on the 21st of March this year, so a week ago, we're still seeing lower levels of retail and recreation. And they include in that restaurants, cafes, shopping centers, theme parks, museums, libraries, and cinemas. Whereas the supermarkets, not that much variation. And then parks, and I was quite surprised by this, but parks were down quite a lot if you think of the mobility trends. And I don't know if that might be because it's national parks is included in there, and perhaps costs and distances to get into national parks and without the foreign share there. But yeah, so we're not seeing, even in a local basis, we're still seeing perhaps South Africans are leaving their homes less, have less money, etc. This is confirmed by FNB's credit card data. I saw a recent release, and this is 18th March 2021. Again, we know this intuitively. So hardware and furnishing, they've seen a growth in sales, and that's because people are at home, working from home, looking around their house, wanting to upgrade, I guess, things, or create spaces to work at home which are more private, or I don't know, just generally improve their home environment. Fuel sales plummeted. Dining out and entertainment for January 2021 was 82% of January 2020, and this would be South African credit card holders, right? So whereas the restaurants data I showed you earlier would be all it was all income in that industry, which is why this is looking a bit better than that other graph. And then the FNB release, as it's quoted in the media, says tourism spend was only 50% of January 2020. So I guess, and I'm interpreting, that would be accommodation and perhaps attractions. That's what they might mean by tourism. But that's, you know, that's horrific, really.
Yeah,
if you think about
that
it.
is horrific.
Yeah.
I'd love to understand what that tourism spend comprises. It's actually worth being in touch with FNB to get a sense of that.
See if there's a more granular. Something more granular on that.
Yeah.
But we did, you know, when I showed you the graph in accommodation, we saw that January was terrible, you know, and we saw that those hotels were down, was it 70% on January 2020? So, you know, that's, and campsites were 37% down, and that's the robust segment there. So that makes sense. It does sort of correlate with that. And then I included the shopping because I thought it was quite interesting. So hyper centers grew the fastest. These were probably where you've got the macros and the likes, and then small centers grew. So people are going to the closest, those who, I guess, who can have the mobility to get to closer centers easily would go there, or neighborhood centers. But the sort of larger malls, which actually saw a decline in footfall. So those are the kind of trends from FNB.
Tourism's biggest competitor then, bizarrely, is Builders Warehouse.
Yep. Yeah. And I mean, I know this anecdotally, but sort of, you know this from consumer trends, but the sort of leisure wear, I'm probably using the wrong, what's the word? You know, the sort of athletic wear at home, and that market's grown.
Yeah.
So sort of, and trainers and stuff like that, as well as hardware and furnishing.
Wow. Yeah. So those people who were homebodies that might have had a bit of wanderlust and would have gone out are now full homebodies, couch potatoes, leisure wear enthusiasts, and not traveling. So actually that for me is the biggest insight out of all of this, is that, you know, in the past we used to compete with tourism. We used to compete with external destinations. And now what we're actually doing is competing with home improvement.
Except that it's 1 month. So I think, so comparing January to January, I think it'll be interesting. It's very hard to know because, of course, we had regulations that were prohibiting beaches and the like. So is this a result of that, and then people cancelling their travel plans and being at home and they're being on holiday, and then looking at what they could do around the house?
Yeah.
Or is it a broader trend around just being anxiety around travel?
It's definitely one to watch in the next
month. Yeah. Okay, so I mean, I'm going straight on to, as much as one can have any conclusions in this fast-moving area, and as you and I were saying earlier, it's really hard to know. Things are changing fast. The data isn't all current. Where it is current, it's not necessarily statistically fully relevant. But what are the kinds of opportunities? So there's that outbound substitution market. So thinking about the high end in terms of income earners who were able to travel for leisure outside of South Africa previously, whether it's to Mauritius or Thailand or the UK or the US. What were they doing on those trips? Are we going to try and create the same kind of experience domestically? Or perhaps we can't. Perhaps we can't provide that all-inclusive beach experience at the same price. So what is it then that those segments might be interested in? What kind of experience are they looking for? And then, you know, looking at that camping and even the guest houses and guest farms, which is the second least badly affected category. So it does seem that the sort of leisure family small group market, you know, groups of friends are looking at the camping. I would think glamping as well. So more price accessible, but also outdoors with activities. I haven't written it there, but I think activities for domestics really, really important. It's not just the accommodation you want to pay for, you want to know what you can do. And then the third third point is around perhaps not even overnight. So, you know, looking at outdoor activity-based stuff locally. And I hike on Table Mountain a couple of times a week. I'm lucky to live close to it, and I can see a complete change in demographics, which is fantastic. So a lot of younger Black South Africans I see in groups hiking. I mean, visibly, noticeably different over a year ago, especially on weekends. So what are the kinds of informal associations and groups and platforms and clubs where one can start building interest? And perhaps that's where one builds those market segments and start talking about, well, what's possible for an overnight trip on a weekend where you can go camp and hike. And then the importance of the local market. So it's not just tourists, it's not just domestic tourists, it's not even just day tripper tourists, it's locals living around us. And of course, this doesn't help accommodation and travel agencies. But for attractions and activities, and we don't have data in this segment, unfortunately, Natalia, it's a great pity. You know, how can you build new local market segments? And I don't know what's happening. You might have heard with, I mean, there were all those Walk My Jersey tours, the Walk Jersey tours that were fantastic and appealed to me. I don't know what's happened with them, but I would have thought, if talking about tour guides, so I live in Newlands. I've been doing some research into the history of Newlands personally because I'm interested. It's not well known. People know a little bit about history from 200, 300 years ago with the breweries around here, but there were forced removals down the road for me, and you find very little about it online. And I think it's really important that we don't forget, but I also think there's an opportunity for some tour guides perhaps to look at parts of big towns and cities where there are geographically contiguous communities where people might be interested in doing walking tours. I don't, you know, it's not going to necessarily save all their income, but I think it's an opportunity.
Point, because immediately, you know, when you're thinking about it from a when you're in a place of disempowerment, you don't think of the opportunity. And when we look at domestic tourism, the first thing we hear from DMC's tourist guides is, well, you know, South Africans know how to travel around their own country, so they are not going to need the services of a tourist guide or of a wheels operator or a travel agent, because they just book their own travel. But this is one very specific opportunity of where there is it might be a micro segment that is interested in the heritage of Newlands, but it exists essentially. So how can you identify that market first and foremost, and secondly, what is the product that you can introduce, or the experience that you can introduce that appeals to that micro segment essentially. So there are, as you say, to your point, it's not even about looking at a massive market. It's about looking at a small market, a very niched market with a very specific interest, and tapping into that.
And I think that in the case of a local walking history tour, whatever kind of tour one would want to do, actually, once you know what you're doing and you've done a bit of market research, communicating is perhaps much easier because it's very direct. So in my case, we have a Google group that it gets administered by a local resident, which has 500 families on it, of which 20% or 30% or 50% might be interested in one morning a month doing a 2-hour walk at a reasonable price.
Such a great idea.
But it's not applicable across the country or every neighborhood at all. I appreciate that, but it does strike me that in some instances it would be. And then the celebration markets. I was talking to someone who works in hotels last week, and I had my birthday last week, and we went out to a local hotel as a family for a meal. And she said that they're also sort of seeing that. So, you know, South Africans can't necessarily afford to go out all the time with a family to a restaurant for a meal, because it's not, you know, it might be very good value, but it's not necessarily cheap, and many people can't afford that. But certainly for your birthday or an anniversary or a celebration, and again, that's the local market often. That struck me as something.
That was one of the things that came out in one of the conversations I had last week, was around traveling for purpose. So traveling because they couldn't travel last year to celebrate a big event, whether it was an anniversary or a birthday. There's this feeling now that one needs to travel as a family or as a bubble, friend bubble, to celebrate a specific event. So that came out quite strongly. And also traveling for purpose. So traveling for a golf tour, for example. If there's something specific that you're going to travel for, that's also been something that came out quite strongly last week.
And there's relatively smaller group sort of sporting or activity-based stuff. So hiking, biking, golf.
It's those
Sorry?
niches. It's those niches. It's really getting down to the detail of it, and seeing, because we look at domestic tourism, we say we have a domestic tourism market, but actually it's not a domestic tourism market. It is a market of Western Cape cyclists or southern suburb cyclists. It's a market of wine lovers in Cape Town. It's about really getting down to those micro market segments and then tapping into them on the platforms that they look at, like that Google platform that you have with your residents.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, and they're also emerging, like I follow a bike club on Twitter in Langa, and in Soweto there's a lot happening around bicycle stuff. So it's not just what would have been seen as privileged white spatially anymore. I think it's shifting, and that's fabulous, and we need to really support that for multiple reasons, not least of all income, but also just because that's the kind of dynamic ways of interacting with each other we desperately need in this country. So but it does require, I guess, as you said, it's really granular. And it's going and having conversations with people and figuring out what are the informal databases sometimes, and then this notion of South Africans who don't want to travel because they don't see a reason. And that's my last point, number 6. So what is that about, And I do think there's a race basis to it. I do think, and it's not my place to say this, but from what I see, many Black South Africans don't feel welcome. And whether it's real, and sometimes it certainly is real, and sometimes it might be perceived, I don't know, but it's a real thing. And tourism operators and owners, particularly because they're still largely white, need to really have a deep think about that, and unconscious bias. And those who have conscious bias perhaps won't think about it. But making everything from your website to your communication to everything far more actively welcoming, inviting. Yeah, and that's the relevance bit as well. And then the packaging, and I mean, we've spoken about the granularity and how you start understanding segments of segments. And then I had another one I wanted to talk, this is more my world, which is more on sort of planning and thinking about things. And for some time I've been saying this to perhaps more to myself than anyone else, but nonetheless, we're so pleased to have a Department of Tourism at a national level, so a standalone department, but actually recreation sits somewhere else. And if you look at local government, the recreation budget often isn't where the tourism budget is, it's even in a different team. So that's why I wanted to show you those pie graphs early on the different tourism industries and where the income comes from, because locals are so important. And so we have this very funny way of thinking about tourism as apart from recreation. We really need to sort that out. And we need to think about, I think, tourism and recreation together in terms of visitor economies. And then we need to think about visitor economies and how they relate to space. And with the kind of spatial challenges we have in South Africa and the legacies of spatial apartheid that persist, how does one think about recreation, mobility, access, from everything from informal markets to formal markets to bicycle routes to better public transport? There's a whole thing there. So rather than focusing on tourism infrastructure per se, how do we think about it a bit more together? I'd like to see that. And then I don't know from an analytics perspective, so I like to think, I certainly know some of the formal stats, and I read a lot of the media, so more economic surveys and stuff. I haven't seen, and I don't know if it happens, but I would like to see, and it's an encouragement to aggregators like Knightsbridge and Web Tickets and others. I'm not sure, I guess they've all got their heads down on their core business, understandably, but it would be nice to see where there are sources of aggregated data that are a meaningful level, some insights. And I know that, I think Knightsbridge was working with the city of Cape Town at one point, or the province anyway, on some of their insights, what happened with the bookings that were cancelled in December, Jan. I saw something in the media about that.
Yeah, there were some really good stats that came out of Bridge, and they ran a survey which was also really interesting for the Garden Route area when the regulations were introduced. But That's a really good point, that coordination of databases and insights. And
Yeah.
whose job is that? Because we're sitting on so much data. There is so much power in that data, and yet it's so disparate. It's kind of everybody owns their little siloed data, and there's nobody that kind of brings it all together. I mean, whose job would that be?
I know the National Department's hoping to do some work in that space. I'm not sure how far along they are. I mean, they are like, it is complicated because you have different definitions that get employed, you know, and so, but if we're just looking at trends, if we don't worry too much about the specificity of the data point and we say, what is the trend, then maybe there are opportunities. I guess people like me as well, who make our bread and butter out of consulting, do it a bit, but I agree with you. I would think, okay, so who you're asking who should do it? I do think that industry associations and government are the two places where they are serving industry and development objectives, and they're the ones who'd be best served by it.
It's an opportunity.
It's an opportunity, yeah. And you need a range of skills, right? You need some data science skills. You need to understand strategy and the questions. Like anything in life, if you don't ask the right questions, you're not going to, the data is not going to answer it. But yeah, definitely an opportunity there. And we spoke, and this point 3 is nothing new, but how does one then talk about smaller groups, outdoors, strict adherence to protocols? I did talk a little bit about sort of historic tours and local neighborhood tours in the previous slide, but I do think then there's a bigger question around how one pulls together partnerships, whether it's between heritage societies and local government or local tourism associations, and also creative sector and tourism. Much like recreation and tourism have been separated, we've also had, certainly at a government level, perhaps not so much in reality on the ground. We have more collaboration between individuals down on the ground, but that thinking that, you know, we really haven't had enough of a coherent, exciting, dynamic strategy, and the creative sector is just devastated, perhaps even more in some instances than tourism. And they of course rely on tourism. But there might be opportunities now for smaller pop-up events, much smaller scale, more, what do they say, hyper-local, that kind of stuff. And so the opportunities there. And I would like, you know, I think there's a great opportunity now for sub-national destination level. So whether it's cities or towns or clusters within towns to work together. So where it's not just a firm level package for a discounted package to stay at a B&B or a lodge, but much more around Clarens, for example, or Bella Bella or Franschhoek or whatever, Paternoster, putting out a package which is like, you know, for 2 nights, mid-market, you know, and then they have multiple product owners within their midst, and saying you can have. We really need that. I don't know. Have you seen it, Natalia? I haven't seen it.
Stellenbosch has done it. They started doing it towards the end of last year, where the accommodation providers work with the experiences to package together. Yes. So you don't buy 2 nights at Bon Esperance Guest House. You buy a package. If you're a foodie, you buy a package with Bon Esperance. It's the Bon Esperance. They've put it together as the accommodation establishment, but they've brought in the experience. So it might be a cooking experience in Kayamandi, or a wine tasting and meal at Blauwklippen, and they've actually packaged for micro segments. If you're a foodie or if you're an outdoors person, you can then look at this array of packages based on your interests, and it's one package essentially, which is great.
And I think like Paternoster, you know, you could have for 1,000 rand per person, you could have 2 nights and a meal at one of the 6 restaurants, 2-course meal, and entry to an attraction, whether it's, I don't know, a walking tour on the beach or the West Coast Fossil Park or whatever. But I just haven't seen that local area. I haven't seen enough of that. And it's easy to criticize. I'm not trying to criticize, but maybe I haven't seen it. Maybe it's been done and I'm not part of the target market.
We need to be better at it. We need to be better at communicating it if you haven't done it. Yeah.
And the other thing that struck me, I mean, you've seen in the media a bit, in other destinations, there's something called, I want to get the name right now. There's like a whole slow walking movement in the UK where they've linked up towns with walks, and it's largely community driven, and there are thousands and thousands of people who participate in it. And Italy linked up their national parks last year. And, we can't do either of those things exactly the same, and perhaps we wouldn't want to, but it would be wonderful to see more collaboration like that as well. And I often wonder, living on the doorsteps of the winelands, why I can't go and hike in the winelands by buying a package where I hike across 3 estates and I come across a picnic in a vineyard for my lunch, and then I can choose to perhaps camp or stay in a B&B or in a smart hotel. I can't do that at all. I've never seen anything like that. So maybe the other thing to say about small towns, and I sometimes I get a bit sad when I see all the work that's done on route development, but that the routes are nowhere near source markets, domestic source markets. So one of the things we do see is that, unfortunately, for very rural towns, that typically it is areas and towns closer to metros where you can derive more domestic tourism demand. Sort of sounds like I'm stating the obvious, but people aren't going to travel 4 hours for a weekend or a night, or maybe they will just 4 hours, but certainly no more than 3 to 4. And so, but really capitalizing on the metros. So places within 2 hours of a metro, looking at these kind of creative, collaborative ventures. I think there's a real opportunity there, especially when you're talking about existing infrastructure. So you're not investing that much you're not building a new experience. You're talking about connecting and packaging and marketing and communicating. And that was my last point, is what we've been talking about. So I don't know. I'm not seeing a lot of it. I'll tell you what I look at. I look at the Inside Guide. I look at budgetgetaways.co.za, and I look at Getaway a bit. But those are the things that come across I get sent things on. But that's me. And I'm, again, a sort of a segment in a segment with a certain profile.
Yeah. I've also a lot of the comms because there's a lot of noise at the moment, being in that communication space, it's not breaking through that noise and being hyper relevant, which speaks to those hyper local micro segments, and really focusing in on what's going to tick their box. But there's also a lack of call to action. So there's a lot of roundup type listicle content out there, the 5 mountain passes that you should. And I sit here and, it's not about me being lazy. It's about, okay, the 5 mountain passes. How do I access that? What is the call to action? Where do I find the tourist guide that's based outside this particular mountain pass that can give me the information? And so we go on part of the journey and we tick the box, but we don't take it to the point where there is actually going to be action, or it inspires easy action, because it's all about being easy. That's the part we're missing in this mix.
Yeah, because we still work quite hard. So when I travel with my family, I don't mind doing it. It's part of it relates to my work anyway. But I still work quite hard, online, looking at all sorts of things and comparing them and trying to figure out stuff. There's some joy in that too, because you feel like you uncovering your own thing. That's a bit more unique. But yeah, maybe it shouldn't be quite so hard.
No, you're
anyway, that's my bit. So those are all the bits, the statistics I could pull together that I thought might be interesting.
And so helpful, the opportunities on the previous slide. I think there are absolutely, anybody looking at this, listening to this now, would be able to take any of those opportunities and apply them to their specific scenario. But for me, the biggest takeaway certainly is those 2 things around making sure that all South Africans feel welcome, and what you can do to do that, but also communicating and marketing, not just to tick the box to say this is what I have, but really helping it resonate by focusing on the right micro segment, those hyper local markets, and those really, really niched down market segments that perhaps we're not looking at, and then communicating it with a view to call to action that's easy, as opposed to just generically providing information that might fit, but they don't have to do anything with it, essentially. They're not inspired to do anything with it. Wow.
Yeah, good. I'm glad it was useful. I do think, and you've helped me get clear on that as well. It is really about the micro segment. And then there are all lots of questions around the data and the communication and partnerships for that. Yeah.
Thank you, Kate, for your time.
This has been great pleasure.
so useful to this industry. Thank you for the time that I can see you've put into this and for your insights. And I look forward to following you on LinkedIn and seeing more of the content that you're creating to help us demystify what's going on, not only in our tourism sector, but beyond. You're doing lots of work in lots of different sectors.
Thank you, Natalia. It's a great pleasure. And I look forward to watching the virtual conference and all the bits of insight and hopefully, hopefully we can this year, as we still struggle to make sense of the world around us, we can find some meaning, in this very local context and building up what we know and understand and asking questions about things we don't know and segments we don't understand.
Yeah.
So it's a great pleasure.